Here's an unusual photo of me that was made by conceptual photo artist Bethany Perron when she recently stayed at my home for a few days, and in this video you'll see how we made it. These are examples of the kind of photos that Bethany creates. She calls her style fantasy art photography, and these are all from her Instagram account, which I encourage you to check out. In this video, you'll get to go behind the scenes with us as Bethany and I work to create a photo together, and then you'll also see her Photoshop process layer by layer as she creates the final artistic photo. But first, let me back up and explain how this all came to pass. Bethany is on a year-long cross-country road trip. After becoming successful at fantasy portraiture in her spare time, she decided to take a bold leap and dedicate herself full-time to her art. So she quit her corporate job, bought a van, outfitted it for living, and decided to spend a full year traveling around the United States, couch surfing with anyone willing to host her, and creating artistic photos of the people she stays with. Now, this is an audacious and maybe even slightly crazy plan, and since I admire her skill and her courage, I wanted to support her. So the first thing I did was to join her Patreon account so that I could follow her progress, watch her video updates and behind-the-scenes videos, read her travel diary, and see all the photos that she's creating while she's on this adventure. And then, at the encouragement of our mutual friend Sebastian, I decided to actually invite Bethany to stay with me for a few nights as she was passing through North Carolina and to do a photo shoot together. Now, Sebastian has known Bethany for many years because she's one of the top students in his famous Photoshop Artistry class. In fact, that's exactly how she learned to do the creative Photoshop work that you see in her photos. She learned it all from Sebastian's course. If you've been with me for a while, you know that I highly recommend Sebastian's Photoshop course. It's called Photoshop Artistry, and I'll put a link to it down below this video if you're interested in learning how to do this kind of artistic photo work yourself. I'll also put a link to Bethany's Patreon account there in case you want to follow her adventures or maybe even support her on her journey. So let's go behind the scenes and see how we turned this boring room into the finished photo that you see here. Now, the concept was all Bethany's idea. She envisioned a kind of a mirror world version of myself trying to pull me through a mirror by grabbing my camera. And originally she thought of shooting it outside in the woods, which would make the Photoshop work easier because reflecting random trees in the mirror would be easier than reflecting a real room. But it was cold on the day we shot this, so I suggested doing it in an upstairs bedroom of my house and trying to make the room look like an attic where a strange old magical mirror might be found. But first we had to get the light in the room under control. So as we're setting this up, here's a look from the camera position at the corner we're going to use. We had to tape a sheet to the wall over here to block some light and make a kind of a gigantic softbox. And I've got another continuous light over on this side that I use for video, just filling in some of the shadows and providing a little support. And here's a look back toward the camera position. Next, we had to make this room look like an attic. To do that, we moved some trunks and chairs and furniture into the room to try to give it an attic-y sort of feel. Then, of course, we got to the fun step of actually shooting the two photos of me that would be composited together in the final photo. We put a tape mark on the floor where the mirror would be in the final photo to help us stand in the right position. To get my camera strap to line up in the two photos with tension on it, we had to take turns occupying the two positions. First, I was being pulled while Bethany stood in for my mirror world self. And then we traded places, and I became the mirror version while Bethany stood in for my regular self. Note that she brought in a little step to stand on to get her height to match mine so that the camera strap would line up in the two photos. Also notice that Bethany is holding her remote shutter release in her hand and she's snapping the photo at what she hopes is just the right moment. So we kept doing take after take until we felt like we had several good photos from each position to work with. After this, it all becomes Photoshop work, so I'll let Bethany take over with the description of her Photoshop process.
Hi, this is Bethany Perron, and I wanted to do a Photoshop tutorial of how I created this image with Phil Steele. You saw us taking these photos in the previous part of this video, and I wanted to have the opportunity to show you how we got from those photos to this final stage. If you're not a regular Photoshop user, some of these techniques may be new to you or seem difficult, But with a little bit of training and a little bit of practice, I promise these are things that you can do too. There are a lot of layers involved, but generally I'm repeating the same techniques over and over again. So I think that you'll enjoy at least just watching, if not picking up some tips and techniques through the process. I'm going to start here at the beginning. This is the plate that I took, which is just a background shot of the room that we were using with no models, nothing in it. I'm going to scroll down to the bottom of my stack here. This is the first image that I chose. I'm standing on a little riser so that I'm the same height as Phil, and I'm just a placeholder so that we can get the angle of the camera fairly correct. I actually have the remote shutter in my hand, and because the camera is on a tripod, you can see that the background does not move. This is the image that I wanted to use of Phil on this side, and then this is the image that I wanted to use of Phil on this side. So now I'm holding the camera. I still have the remote in my hand here, and I'm just trying to get the camera, again, at a similar angle. I'm using layer masks to mask out the parts that I don't want. And the mask is here, this rectangle with the little circle on it. You can see that I've painted away me. That blob was me. And what I'm doing is revealing the image below, which is Phil on this side. I also used a mask on this part of Phil in order to mask him to fit the mirror, so I'll come back to that one in a minute. And then if you look carefully, you can see that we didn't get the camera to line up perfectly well. That would have been pretty difficult to do. We were both sort of moving. And so what I needed to do was to select out the camera and Phil's hands on this side, create its own layer, and move it upwards. I just free transformed it and moved it up so that it aligned with the strap on this side. And then I needed to mask that away, like this, with this mask. This mask also is going to remove his leg, which is going to be hidden by the mirror. And obviously I need to do a little cleanup here where I moved the camera. And that's just a couple of layers of color and tone to just fix that. Now I have both Phils here. And I did decide to take out this little door on the side. In the end, it probably didn't matter because I cropped it in so tightly that you pretty much don't see it anyway, but I wasn't sure how tight of a crop I was going to go for right in the beginning. So I did just grab a few other panels from this ceiling section and drop them over here in order to hide that door. Then if I scroll up, we're going to add the mirror. So here's the mirror. This was an Adobe stock image. It looked like that if I take my masks out. And I used this mask to take away the outside and inside of this frame. And then another mask to allow me to bring Phil forward in front of this edge. Now you can see why I had masked out his leg on this side, because otherwise it would have shown through behind the mirror and would have ruined the illusion. The mirror needed a lot of work to get it to look like it was in place where I wanted it and that it fit the scene. So I needed to do a few adjustment layers to desaturate it and tone it down and make it look like it fits. Then I wanted to create a reflection so that it didn't just look like a hollow frame, it actually looked like it was reflecting this side of the room. Again, in the final image, I don't think you can really tell that. I ended up darkening it so much, but you don't know as you go. It's a creative process. So here is my reflection folder, and what I did is back on that plate that had no people in it, I grabbed a section of the room here and flipped it. So you can see it has a little bit of the chair and a little bit of the trunk. I flipped it and I masked it Here's the image without the mask. I also did a little perspective warp on it too. And some levels and hue saturation adjustments to darken it to start to get that dark mirror feel. And then having to mask Phil so that he looks like he's in front of the reflection. Now I need to make the surface of the mirror look like it is a flat plane, and again, instead of just a hollow opening into another room. So I darkened the whole interior, again masking out just a little bit so that Phil looks like he's kind of coming through that surface plane. Added a few glints to create the mirror surface. A little bevel at the top and sides just to give it some depth, and what I called the sizzle, which is this little line so that it just looks like some magic, you know. He's coming through the surface and there's something a little fantastical about it. That creates the whole mirror, although I did need to do a drop shadow at the bottom so that it looks like it's sitting on the floor. And there's the drop shadow. So that completes my mirror folders here. Now I need to do a little bit more work on Phil because he still looks a little too bright, in my opinion, for someone who's in this dark mirror interior. So I added a bunch of levels layers and hue saturation layers to make him fit into the mirror version of him. Then I wanted to work on the room a little bit. I did a little trunk shading because it didn't seem right that the light coming from this window would be reflecting here, especially when I'm planning on cropping this section out. I wanted this to be darkened down. So some shading and some pin light to take the highlights out, a little bit of cloning to remove the outlets and the tape on the floor, and then some dodge and burn layers to just take some of the hot spots off of Phil's skin. To create a little bit more fantasy, I added a whole bunch of smoke layers pouring out of the bottom of the mirror. These are stock smoke images and smoke brushes, and there's just a bunch of layers here that I layered on to create this whole smoke effect. It was at this point that I decided to actually go ahead and create the crop that I wanted before I started to do the color grading. So I'm just going to pop over here where I've done the crop, and I decided to do a square crop. It really helped to put Phil and this center section in the spotlight of the image. I was feeling like it was all a little lost in the room here. And so above the smoke layer, I added a couple of webs. They're very subtle. I don't know if you even see them in the final image. There's 3 little webs here to give you kind of an attic-y feel or a creepy feel. A photo filter layer to start to push everything toward blue because I thought that this was a little yellowy, orangey looking. A color lookup table. I always use a soft light layer to create my dodging and burning, and this is a layer that is set to the soft light blend mode, and then I use a black brush and a white brush alternately to push the lighting the way I want it. So if I turn this off and on, you can see how the wall looks very bright and Phil almost looks a little dark in comparison. And this way I darkened the wall and brightened him so that he stands out more. Then I ran a camera raw filter. I created a merged visible layer and converted it to a smart object. If this is all beyond what you know at this point, that is fine. These are all very common learnable techniques. You can find tutorials on how to do all of this. Once you've created your smart object layer, you can come up to your filter and camera raw filter, which gives you a lot of the same effects as Lightroom does. It's a very, very similar interface to Lightroom. So that's a great way to achieve some of the effects that you might already be used to. In the camera raw, I used a color profile, which also had a vignette in it, and that helped to create some depth, some contrast, to really push your eye to the center of the image. And then a couple of little effects that I like to do all the time, an Orton effect, which helps to soften it and give it a little bit of a fairy tale feel, and a high pass filter, which just sharpens the two fills. The Orton effect softens it up a little bit, and the high pass allows me to sharpen that back up. And then signature layer and the final image. So I hope you enjoyed this tutorial. I know I went really fast through it, but as I said, these are all very learnable techniques with practice. So I hope that you get inspired to learn more about Photoshop and learn how to create your own fantasy composites.
If you'd like to follow along with Bethany on her cross-country photo adventure, you can join her Patreon page, where you can read her travel diary and see each of the projects she works on as she goes along. And if you're in the USA and feeling really inspired by this, you might even invite her to stay with you when she swings through your part of the country, as I did. And once again, if you'd like to learn how to do this kind of creative photo editing yourself, you can learn it from the same place that Bethany did, and that is Sebastian Michael's Photoshop Artistry course. I'll put a link to it down below. I hope you found this interesting, and I'll talk to you again soon.